One thing you quickly learn as you get to know the people at the Riverside Church is that there are a lot of smart people sitting out in those pews. So with all due respect to you brilliant academics out there, I have to tell you today that the most important lesson I learned when I was finishing my dissertation for my doctoral work was this. Sometimes it is not exceptional creativity, deep and profound insight, or even all that much intelligence that gets you to the end of a doctoral dissertation. Sometimes it's just tenacity. I learned this lesson from my doctoral supervisor when one day, as the deadline for my dissertation was looming on the horizon too close for comfort, I sat in her office and she said to me, "Amy, just lock yourself in a room, sit at the computer and write. Put words on paper until you get to the end." At the apartment building where I lived at the time, there was, in fact, just down the hall from my apartment, a closet with a desk and one light bulb overhead. I did exactly what she said. I went to the closet, I closed the door, and I wrote until I was finished. I'm fairly certain the material I produced is not Albert Einstein-esque, but I learned an important lesson from that experience. Sometimes the way that you make it through to the end is simply just by putting one foot in front of the other, enduring. Today we're in the middle of several weeks of passages from the small book of 2 Timothy. You'll remember that 2 Timothy is a letter, a little epistle in the New Testament, a set of instructions from an elder to a student, specifically about how to navigate organizational change and conflict within and around the first Christian church. In 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, as we learned last week, the writer of the letters makes veiled references to the life of an athlete and compares the life of an athlete to the life of faith. References like this familiar verse that you will recognize. "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." All throughout both 1 and 2 Timothy, the writer seems to emphasize three essential qualities of a successful athlete: strength, endurance, and flexibility, suggesting that these are just the things that early Christians would need if they were going to survive the considerable challenges of living their faith in a world that not only disagreed with what they believed, but actively persecuted them for their beliefs. Last week we read a passage about remembering what lies behind, how so many who have gone before us have modeled for us the kind of strength we need to summon to live the life of faith. Today our passage talks about what lies within, the faith claim that we can return to again and again and again when things feel too overwhelming or hard, and when we feel like dropping out of the race. When that inevitability happens, how will we make it all the way to the end? We will do what any good athlete does. We will endure. We'll keep going, one foot in front of the other, drawing strength from the faith that lies within us until we cross the finish line. In our passage today, the author reminds his student of this very thing. Remember Jesus Christ. Remember the faith that is in you and endure. Endure all the way until the end. You'll recall that the situation this author is addressing is more than mere inconvenience, but some deep hardship. People were being imprisoned, persecuted, cut off from their families, even killed for their faith. Staying the course for these first Christians was no small thing. Sometimes it cost their very lives. After reminding his student that much of the work of a Christian is enduring, Hanging on until the end, the author then quotes what scholars think was an early Christian hymn in verses 11 through 13, as if to remind his readers that they're not being asked to endure just for the sake of enduring. No, endurance for a Christian is not optional. It is a hallmark of the Christian life, a fundamental expectation for all of us who say that we are followers of Jesus Christ. Now, it's hard for you and me, modern day Christians, to understand the risk that those first Christians took to claim their faith. You and I experience Christian practice, especially in this country, as extremely culturally acceptable. Too much. Too culturally acceptable. And perhaps this is where our challenge lies. Living in a culture where Christian faith is often co-opted by American identity and shaped into perverted practice that, instead of standing against evil and sin in the culture around it, has instead become a vehicle for the perpetration of sins like racism and sexism and homophobia and violence, and so many other things that do not reflect the radical love of Jesus. We don't relate fully to the experience of the first Christians and the challenges they faced, but we understand that holding on to an ethic of radical love, insisting that the way of Jesus is not the way of our culture, well, that's going to take some endurance. As you know, this past week, over 100 faith leaders from around the country, Christians, Muslims, Jews, gathered here at the Riverside Church to have a serious conversation about gun violence in our country and the role of the faith community in addressing that violence and in changing a culture of death in America. Speaking from this podium on Friday night, Congressman Jim Himes from Connecticut's 4th District choked up as he told us about his constituents' persistent question to him: what are you doing about this? Himes told us that his house is only 25 miles from Newtown, Connecticut, and Sandy Hook Elementary School. So these questions, they're not theoretical, they're personal. Earlier this summer, after the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Himes tweeted that he would no longer stand for a moment of silence as Congress began its workday. There have been too many moments of silence and nothing substantive done to change anything, he said. But his dilemma, he said to all of us who had spent the whole day learning about gun violence and our role in changing it, is that laws alone will not change this trend in our culture. There is something in the fabric of American Christianity especially that has come to understand the unrestricted ownership of guns as a fundamental American and Christian right. The only thing that'll stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. We heard American Christian leaders proclaim that in the film The Armor of Light on Thursday evening, and this statement is parroted all over our country. As we listen to Congressman Himes, surely the words of Reverend Rob Shank, an evangelical leader we heard on Thursday night, were ringing in our ears. I have an increasing number of colleagues, he said, who would never think of entering the pulpit in their church without carrying a loaded weapon. One colleague told me that if a congregation member as much as stood up or called out a comment during a sermon, he would take out his weapon and shoot to kill immediately. Several of you asked me if I carry a weapon in the pulpit after that. In light of this conflated gun culture and Christian faith in America, our job as faith leaders is more critical than it has ever been. Congressman Himes told us that it's not just laws that need to change, it's hearts. And that's why our shared work of training faith leaders to teach, preach, and organize around gun violence is so, so important. Faith leaders do the work of helping change hearts. That's our specialty. But as Congressman Himes was speaking, I kept thinking about the stories that I had heard from my colleagues at the conference all day long. I live in rural Virginia. I'm a young pastor, only 2 years in. I have a family to support, and the job market is tight. I'm scared to talk about gun violence in my church because I'm afraid I will lose my job. All day long at our God and Guns training, faith leaders shared stories like that, and I could see the internal struggle of so many of my colleagues. How can we keep going in the direction of what is right when it's so hard? How can we keep pushing at the work to change hearts, even with resistance? How can we endure when the potential cost is so very high? At least for me, I heard an answer to that question immediately after lunch on Friday when all of us gathered in the Riverside Theater to hear a panel of survivors talk about their experiences. On the panel was Natasha Christopher, who in 2012 lost her son Akil on his 15th birthday. Akil was shot right between the eyes while he was walking down a sidewalk in Bushwick. Natasha, along with the others on the panel, talked about their anger, their frustration, their pain, all of the loss that comes with living through a tragedy like that. She told us about these last 4 years, about trying to rebuild her life and the lives of her other children since Akil's death. My surviving children have had their innocence taken away, she said. They learned far too young that life is full of violence, that you can lose someone you love in an instant, that they are not safe. Natasha talked about how telling her story has helped her begin to piece her life back together, to keep going every day when she wakes up with tremendous grief and thinks about her son Akil every waking moment of every day. It seemed to me that if Natasha Christopher can get out of bed every morning and keep telling the story of her son's death so that other people can hear the results of the unchecked proliferation of guns in our country, then perhaps faith leaders and people of faith can begin to heed the call and step up and begin applying our efforts to change the hearts and minds toward divorcing the American love affair with guns from the framework of Christian faith. They don't belong together. We are the ones who need to speak boldly to say that death and violence, they're unacceptable in our churches, in our communities, in our countries. The Bible says that perfect love casts out fear. South African presenter Alan Story told us in his plenary session on gun violence from an international perspective, you do not love your congregations if you are afraid of them. You love them when you have the courage to tell the truth. I think many faith leaders left the Riverside Church after God and Guns this week, convinced that doing the work of changing hearts is critical. Because standing by while violence continues to shred lives like Natasha Christopher's is not reflective of the radical gospel of love that Jesus came to teach us. But proclaiming that message is going to invite criticism and resistance and consequences. How can we face that and keep going? We do it by enduring, by revisiting what lies within, the conviction that it's love that can change the world, even when the change seems so far off, it doesn't even seem realistic. We endure. We keep going. We put one foot in front of the other over and over and over until we make it to the finish line. The writer of 2 Timothy knew this truth. Sometimes, very often, it's not exceptional creativity, deep and profound insight, or even all that much intelligence that gets you to the end of the race. Sometimes it's just tenacity. As modern Christians, we're called to do the same work of love that the first Christians were called to do, living that radical love that Jesus came to teach us in a world where we meet resistance at every turn. We can't give in and allow our faith to be co-opted by the culture around us. Instead, we stand up, we speak out, we face opposition, and when we're most overwhelmed and overcome, we look back at the faith within us and we put one foot in front of the other, all the way to the finish line. Amen.